Hello everyone, let's review some trig graphing for our quiz. First thing, I'll show you all of the things that you're going to run into when you do these problems. So we have A, B, H, and K. Let's talk about what the easy ones do first. A is the number that is in front being multiplied. It's called the coefficient of the sine or cosine function. And when you make this one bigger, this is changing the amplitude. So the amplitude stretches it out vertically. We're talking about how far above and below the midline you're going. If it's 2.2, 2.2 is the biggest y value. Negative 2.2 is the smallest y value. You can't really see that right there, okay? So that's going to determine your y-axis. That's called the amplitude. B determines the x-axis, the period. This is going to squish or stretch out horizontally. So you notice how if you make it twice as big, it's half the period. So from 0 to 1 pi right now, but if I keep it at 1, it's 0 to 2 pi. And something that's a good idea when you're doing this, I'm going to do this right now while I'm thinking about it, is go to the wrench right here, and where it says x-axis step, just put like pi or pi over 2. That way your x-axis will get relabeled in terms of pi, which is really how we want our x-axis to be labeled. So A stretches it vertically, B stretches it horizontally, and H, x minus H, this is the trickiest one. This is how you move it left and right. Those are called phase shifts, and we will see some phase shifts, but what you really just need to be looking for is, see how this point right here is at 0, 0? If I move it to the right 1, now it's at 1, 0. If I move it to the right 2, now it's at 2, 0. Usually those are in terms of like fractions of pi, but that's where you need to look, is where this thing starts. If you know where to look, phase shifts will be okay. And then H changes the midline. It's just like every other function, guys. On the inside, it's left and right, and on the outside, it's up and down. This moves it up and down. So if I make this 0.6, the midline is now 0.6. And I encourage you to write the equation, y equals whatever the midline is. That way you can see all of the points that you actually care about. So I'll be doing that when I go through these. All right, so we're going to graph a handful of these problems. I just went through this, so I'll say the vocabulary you need is A is the amplitude. That's above and below the midline. B is changes the period, and it's 2 pi, 2 times pi divided by B to find the period. H, these are called phase shifts. These are horizontal translations. And then K is the midline, which we'll call a vertical translation. Okay. So let's look at this one, and the first thing you should probably do is find the midline. So if you see that it goes down to -2 and up to 4, those are 6 apart. So we'll go up 3, and that should be the middle. Right there, that's the middle. We call that the midline. Okay, and you can see that it's passing through the y value 1, so it's y equals 1. The next easiest thing to find would be the amplitude. From 1 to 4, you're going up 3, and from 1 to -2, you're going down 3. We just say the amplitude is always positive, so the amplitude is 3. Okay, so we've got the amplitude in the midline is pretty easy. The last one is the period, and this can be tricky. It depends on if there's a phase shift or not, really. In this problem, I'm going to just say, look, this thing starts right there, so I'm going to go from peak to peak. It doesn't matter if you do it this way or if you do it from where it hits the midline, but this is probably the easiest way to see this one. From 0, that's the x-coordinate 0, to 8 pi, this distance across is 8 pi. That's called the period, 8 pi. See, it says 8 pi right there. So that's the period. You started at 0 and you went to 8 pi, so that's the period. It's the time it takes to complete one cycle. See how it's at the top, and then it's at the top? Okay. We could also do the same thing from the bottom to the bottom, and it would still be 8 pi. If you look right here, 4 pi, and then here is 12 pi. It's still 8 pi apart. 4 and 12 are 8 apart. Let's find the midline of this one. It looks like it's right there. Usually you can eyeball it, and that's passing through y equals 4. So y equals 4. The amplitude is 1 plus or minus above the midline, so the amplitude is 1. And now the period, again, it doesn't matter where you start, so let's go from like here to there. Okay, this is -4 pi over 3. And then you can see it's on the way up again. So the period should be 4 pi over 3. But you could also start at 0 and see the same thing. See, it's on its way up, and then it's at 4 pi over 3. So either -4 pi over 3 to 0, or 0 to 4 pi over 3. It keeps doing the same thing over and over again. All right, now actually drawing them, if there's no phase shift, you should probably be able to do this without a calculator, but I'm going to use Desmos, and you're allowed to use Desmos. First, the amplitude is 3, and there's no vertical shift, so on the y-axis, I have 3 and negative 3. That's 0. It's like plus 0, fine, the middle is 0, okay? The other thing we're going to do is put 4 tick marks on here, and since there's no b value, the b value is 1, so 2 pi over 1, the period is 2 pi. That means if you start at 0, you will end at 2 pi. And you could probably draw this without having to get on Desmos. If that's 2 pi, halfway there is 1 pi. Half of that is pi over 2. And now you're counting by 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2. This is 3 pi over 2, and this would be 4 pi over 2, which is 2 whole. It is negative, so normally sine functions look like that, but since it's negative, it's going to be upside down. So it's there, then the bottom, then the midline, then the top, and then back to the midline. So it looks like this when it's all said and done. Okay, smooth curves. Nothing too fancy there, just change the amplitude. It's a negative sine function. But you can now graph these in Desmos and make sure that you are doing them right. Let's graph negative 3 times the sine of x. And I want to make sure that I can scale this well. You can see it starts at 0, 0, pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. So if I look at your paper and I look at that graph, they should be the same thing. Pi over 2 is at negative 3, pi is at 0, 3 pi over 2 is at the top, and 2 pi is back to 0. So you're just drawing these 5 points. Okay, that's one cycle of the function. Let's try another one. In this problem, you have 2 being added on. Now, sometimes we write it like this with the plus 2 on the end, but in general, we like to put this up front because it's confusing sometimes. Like, is that on the inside or is that on the outside? Like, if you don't put the parentheses, it's sometimes ambiguous. So this is the midline, y equals 2. If that's the midline and the amplitude is 3, then when you go above that 3 units, now you're at 5. And if you go below that, now you're at negative 1. So be careful. If there's a midline shift, your y-axis will not be opposites. Now I'm going to put my 4 tick marks on here, and again, since there's no b value, it's still 2 pi over 1, which is 2 pi. That means these don't change. Okay. There's no phase shift. It's the same 4 points every time if the period doesn't change. However, this is a cosine function, so instead of starting at the midline, cosine starts at the top and then hits the midline. So it looks like this. And you want to make sure that you're drawing it so it looks like it's turning around. That way it looks nice and pretty. It looks like that, okay? So now I've graphed it. I'm going to see how I did in Desmos. 2 plus 3 times the cosine of x. Okay, so you can see the midline is at 2, so it's a good idea to say y equals 2. Y equals 2, so you can see the points that you're graphing. I don't like that that's red or green though, but it's okay. And you can see that at 0, it's at 5, and then at pi over 2, it's at 2. Its smallest is negative 1. 3 pi over 2, and then back to 5. So 0, 5, yep, that's 0, 5. Pi over 2 is at 2. Pi over 2 is at 2. See, this midline is this right here. Okay, it's not the x-axis. Pi over 2 is at 2. Pi is at negative 1. Yep, 3 pi over 2 is back to 2, and 2 pi is at 5. So that's the graph that we're drawing. All right, this one's going to be a little tougher because, number one, you have a phase shift. So on the inside, if it's x minus, that means it's going right pi. So we are looking at where x is pi. That's our start. It's not 0 anymore. There is no coefficient, so the amplitude is 1. Oops. There's a 1 in the front, so I'll just go up and down 1. And since there's no vertical shift, there's like a plus 0 on the end. The x-axis is still 0. That's 0. The other thing in this problem is there is a b value, so I'm going to do 2 pi divided by 1/2. And when I copy, change, flip that, 2 pi times 2 over 1, I get a period of 4 pi. So think about it before we check it in Desmos. If you have a period of 4 pi and there are 4 tick marks, each one is counting by pi. So 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. But you didn't start at 0. You started at 1 pi. So 1 pi plus 4 pi, you should be ending at 5 pi. And you're starting at 1, so then this should be 2, 3, 4, and you will end at 5. 1 plus 4, this is 4 pi, start to finish. 1 plus 4 pi is 5 pi. So that should be our x-axis. Now, it's a sine function, so when I draw it, I'll start at the midline, I'll go up, back to the midline, and down, back to the midline. Okay? The trick, though, is you need to make sure when you look at Desmos, you know where to start. If you don't know to start at x equals pi, you're not going to know what you're graphing. So because there's a phase shift, I have to look where x equals pi. So I'll look at this one now. I don't need that midline. X equals pi is where I'm starting. That's my first point right there, pi. 2 pi's at 1, and I'm going to shrink this and stretch it a little bit so I can see it all. But what we're graphing is right here, pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, 5 pi. And you can see that it goes up to 1 and down to negative 1. That's the graph we're drawing. You just have to realize that because of that phase shift, you should start looking at the beginning of that, x equals pi. And if it helps you to draw x equals pi, then you can do that, and you can see that's where I'm starting, and then 5 pi is where I'm ending. Let's try some more. Maybe a couple more. I bet we have at least one more phase shift. All right, no phase shift in this problem. 1/2 is the amplitude, 1/2. So on the y-axis, 1/2, negative 1/2. 1, 2, 3, 4. The period's supposed to be 2 pi, but in this problem there's a b value. So we're going to divide it by 2, and now our period is 1 pi. Hopefully you can start to do this in your head. If you don't have a phase shift, you're starting at 0. The period's pi, so now you're ending at pi. So this is pi over 2. That's halfway. And then half of 1/2 is 1/4. And that's how I think about it, is each tick mark is pi over 4. If this is pi, do 1/4 of that. 1/4, 2/4, 2/4 is 1/2, 3/4, and then 4/4 is 1 whole. Last thing, because it's cosine, you start at the top, and you just make sure you draw the right function. So it looks like this. There you go. Okay. Now, there's no phase shift, so I can just graph it and hopefully look at it. 1/2 cosine 2x. Yep, and I really think it's important you guys know how to stretch these things out. So we're starting right here at 1/2, pi over 4. 2 pi over 4 is 1/2, 3 pi over 4, and then pi is at 1/2 again. So it's up and down, plus and minus 1/2, and it ends at pi. All right. If the b value's odd, these are usually the annoying ones, but there's no vertical shift, so 2 and negative 2, and that's 0. 1, 2, 3, 4. The amplitude is 2. 2 pi divided by this b value is 2 pi over 3. So there's nothing you can do. We're going to end at 2 pi over 3. But again, just to practice for you folks going on to pre-calc next year, if you multiply that by 1/4 to figure out what each tick mark is worth, you get pi over 6. So we should be counting by pi over 6s. This is 1 pi over 6. 2 over 6 is 1/3. 3 over 6 is 1/2, and 4 over 6 reduces to 2/3. So if I draw a cosine function, it would look like this, but it's negative, so it's upside down. It starts at the bottom and then goes up, like this. That's pretty good. Okay. Now, always a good idea to check it in Desmos. -2 times the cosine of 3x. And you can see that it's upside down because it's a negative cosine, and then it hits pi over 6. 2 over 6 is 1/3. 3 over 6 is 1/2. And 4 over 6 is 2/3. So those are the 5 points that I care about. All right, one more that's got a phase shift and a vertical shift and a period change. This is about as bad as they get. First thing, -3, right here, -3. There's no coefficient, so the amplitude is 1. So if you go above that, you're at -2, and if you go below -3, you're at -4. All right, now, because there's a phase shift, I'm going to start at x equals pi over 2, okay? That's because it moves right pi over 2. And now the period is supposed to be 2 pi, but it's cut in half, so now it's 1 pi. So if you can think about the fractions, what are we counting by? Pi over 4 is each tick mark. But how many pi over 4s is this? 1/2 is 2/4. So it should be, if this is 2/4, and I'm counting by 1/4, 3/4, 4/4 is 1 whole, 5/4 and 6/4 is 3/2. Okay, and since it's a sine function, I'm going to start at the midline, then go up. So it looks like this. It's not my best. Okay, but let's graph it in Desmos and see. Should be starting at pi over 2. The most important thing is because of the phase shift, we're starting at pi over 2. So start there. Where's pi over 2? Right here. No, that's pi over 4. There, no. I should do the midline. The best thing to do, if you can't find it, is to graph the midline. Y equals -3. There we go. Okay, so there's pi over 2. Now we're good. Start at pi over 2. This is, remember, you're counting by pi over 4. So 2 over 4 is 1/2. 3 over 4, 4 over 4, 5 over 4, and 6 over 4. So those are the 5 points that we're drawing. How'd I do? At -2, down here to -4, looks good. Okay? So it's important that you guys can recognize the phase shift so you can use Desmos. But everything else you shouldn't really need Desmos for. You can use Desmos, but the more you can do without it, the easier this is going to be for you because it makes more sense. So make sure you guys finish up your review, finish up your homeworks, and make sure you smash that like and subscribe.